There is a number sitting in your subconscious mind right now, and you did not put it there. Somebody else did years ago, and every decision you have made since has been quietly obeying it. It is the number of what you believe you are allowed to have, not what you are capable of, not what you deserve, what you are allowed to have. And until tonight, you have probably never questioned where that number came from. A man spent 20 years of his life interviewing over 500 of the wealthiest, most accomplished people on the planet, trying to find the one thing they all shared. He expected to find a formula about money. He found something else entirely. He found that every single one of them had, at some point, quietly rewritten that invisible number in their own mind. And once he saw it in one of them, he saw it in all of them. Tonight, you are going to find out exactly how they did it, and more importantly, how you are going to do it too, starting before you fall asleep. But first, let's talk about where you actually are right now, because I think I already know. Maybe you're lying there with the day finally quiet, and the second the noise stops, the doubt gets loud. Maybe you have a plan, a real one, written down somewhere, and you have followed it mostly, and yet nothing seems to be moving. Perhaps right now you are doing everything the books tell you to do, waking up early, reading the right things, working the extra hour nobody sees. And still, somewhere underneath all that effort, there's a whisper telling you that maybe this just isn't going to be your story. Maybe you're the exception. Maybe everyone else figures it out, and you're the one who doesn't. Perhaps you've started to measure your worth by your bank balance and hate that you do and can't stop doing it anyway. Maybe you look at people who seem to have caught some wave you never even saw coming, and you wonder what they know that you don't. You tell yourself it's timing, or luck, or connections you never had. And some nights that story is comforting because it means it was never your fault. But other nights, it eats you alive because some small, stubborn part of you refuses to believe that's really the whole truth. Maybe you've even set goals before, real ones with real deadlines, and watched yourself quietly let them slide once life got busy again. And afterward, you didn't call it quitting. You called it being realistic, being responsible, prioritizing what actually matters. Those words feel mature. Sometimes they even are. But sometimes, if you're honest with yourself in this exact moment, they were just a softer way of saying you didn't believe it was really going to work, so you protected yourself from finding out for sure. I want you to sit with that feeling for one more second because it matters. That discomfort is not weakness. It is proof that something in you already knows there's more available than you're currently living. Hold on to that. We're going to use it. Think about how much of your day is actually spent running someone else's program, the alarm someone else designed, the commute someone else's city planning decided for you, the scroll through a feed engineered by people who studied your attention more closely than you've ever studied your own mind. Is it any wonder the number sitting in your subconscious was written by someone else too? Nobody sits you down at 7 years old and asks what you believe you deserve. That belief gets installed sideways through a parent's stress about money, a teacher's offhand comment, a friend's jealousy disguised as advice. By the time you're old enough to question it, it doesn't feel like a belief anymore. It feels like a fact about who you are. That is the trap. And it is exactly the trap this 20-year study cracked wide open. Here's what makes this different from another empty motivational speech. This wasn't a man guessing. He was handed an assignment by one of the richest, most ruthlessly practical industrialists in the country, a man who had no patience for theory that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The challenge was blunt. Spend the next 2 decades studying the most successful people alive and dead, strip away everything sentimental, and tell me what actually repeats. Not what sounds inspiring, what repeats. And after 500 interviews, after failures and bankruptcies and second acts, a pattern emerged that was almost uncomfortably simple. It wasn't about where these people started. It was about a handful of internal decisions they each made, usually quietly, usually before anyone else believed in them. Here is where the story of that 20-year study actually begins. The man conducting it wasn't chasing an abstract theory. He'd been personally challenged by one of the richest industrialists in America to find out what made extraordinary success repeatable instead of accidental. And the deeper he went, the more he kept bumping into the same starting point in every single life he studied. Before any of these people built anything the world could see, they built something the world couldn't see, a decision. sharp, specific, and burned into the mind like a brand, not a wish, not a hope, a decision. This is the principle of definiteness of purpose, and it is where every version of transformation actually begins. Most people live with a general foggy desire to do well or be successful, and that fog is precisely why nothing ever crystallizes. A vague target produces vague effort, and vague effort produces exactly the vague stuck life so many people are quietly suffering through right now. The people this researcher studied were different. They didn't want success. They wanted a specific outcome by a specific time frame for a specific reason, and that specificity acted like a signal flare their entire mind and body could organize around. Take the young man who would go on to build one of the largest industrial empires in American history. Before he owned a single steel mill, before he had any capital worth mentioning, he was a boy working a telegraph line, and he made an internal decision that he would master, then dominate, an entire industry, not vaguely someday, but as a defined destination he oriented his whole life toward. He didn't know every step at the start. Nobody ever does. But he knew the destination with a clarity that let him say yes to the right opportunities and no to everything else for decades without hesitation. That clarity is what turned a telegraph boy into one of the most powerful industrialists the world has ever seen. Notice what that clarity actually did for him practically. It wasn't magic, it was a filter. Every offer, every partnership, every distraction that crossed his path got measured against one question: does this move me toward the destination or away from it? Most people never build that filter, which is exactly why they say yes to everything that feels urgent and end up busy without ever ending up anywhere. Busyness is not the same as progress, and I think somewhere underneath the exhaustion, you already know that. You can run at a sprint for years in the wrong direction and call it hard work. The industrialists in that study weren't necessarily working harder than everyone around them. They were working towards something sharper than everyone around them, and that sharpness did more of the heavy lifting than the hours ever did. Here's the part most people skip past too quickly. Definiteness of purpose isn't about knowing the whole staircase. It's about being able to see the first step clearly enough to actually take it, and being willing to define the second step once you're standing on it. The fog doesn't lift all at once. It lifts one decision at a time. And the decision to stop being vague is the one that has to happen first, because nothing else on this list works without it. Faith needs a target. Persistence needs a target. Even the people around you can't align with a purpose you haven't defined yet, because how could they align with something that doesn't exist outside your own head? Here's your action step, and I want you to actually do this before you sleep tonight, not just nod along. Take one goal that currently lives in your head as a vague feeling. I want to be successful. I want more money. I want to matter. And rewrite it as one sentence with a number and a date in it, not a paragraph. One sentence. Read it out loud to yourself before you close your eyes tonight. That single sentence is the seed everything else in this video is going to grow from. Now, once you have a defined target, the next principle is the one that decides whether you'll actually walk toward it or quietly talk yourself out of it in 6 weeks. That principle is faith. And I don't mean religious faith, though it can include that. I mean an unshakable, almost irrational internal certainty that the goal is not just possible, but already, in some sense, yours. Most people believe faith is passive. A nice feeling you either have or you don't, like being naturally optimistic or naturally anxious. But Hill's research proves something almost the opposite. Faith in the people he studied wasn't a personality trait. It was a trained state built deliberately through repeated thought, the same way a muscle is built through repeated resistance. This is one of those myth-busting moments worth sitting with. You have probably been waiting to feel ready or feel confident before you take the big step, as if that feeling has to arrive first. But every person in that study built the feeling after the decision, not before it. They acted their way into the belief. The belief did not arrive first and grant them permission. The clearest example of this might be the man who, in an era when almost everyone considered the automobile a rich man's toy, decided he would build a car that ordinary working families could actually afford. Nearly every expert around him thought it was financially impossible. Banks doubted him. Engineers doubted the tolerances he demanded. but he held an internal, almost stubborn certainty that it could be done, long before there was a single piece of evidence proving it. That certainty is what kept him funding attempt after failed attempt, until the assembly line that would change the entire world finally worked. He didn't have faith because he had proof. He had proof because he had faith first. Ask yourself honestly, how many times have you waited for the evidence before you were willing to commit? How many times has "let me see if this actually works first" quietly become the reason you never really started at all? That instinct feels like caution. Often it's actually just faith's absence wearing a more respectable costume. The people in this study weren't reckless. They weren't ignoring risk. They simply refused to let the absence of proof function as proof of impossibility, and that single distinction is worth more than almost anything else in this video. There's a second layer to faith that rarely gets talked about, and it's this. Faith has to survive contact with other people's doubt, because other people's doubt is coming guaranteed. Somebody close to you is going to hear your goal and, with good intentions, try to talk you out of the risk. Somebody is going to remind you of every reason it hasn't worked before. That moment is not a sign you were wrong. It is simply the toll booth every serious goal has to pass through. The industrialist who built that affordable car faced boardrooms full of doubt, repeatedly, and kept going anyway. Not because he didn't hear them, but because his internal certainty had been trained to outweigh their external skepticism. Your action step here is simple and slightly uncomfortable, which is exactly why it works. Speak your one-sentence goal out loud, in the present tense, as if it has already happened, once in the morning and once before bed, for the next 7 days. I know how strange that feels the first time. Do it anyway. This is not about magical thinking. It is about training your nervous system to stop treating your own goal like a stranger. There's a reason faith has to come before the next principle, and not after it. You cannot repeat a belief into your subconscious with any real force if some part of you is still privately convinced it's a lie. The words would just bounce off. Faith is what gives the repetition its weight. Once you've built even a thin layer of internal certainty that something is possible, repetition stops being empty positive thinking and starts becoming actual programming. That's the order these principles work in. And skipping a step is exactly why so many people try affirmations for a week, feel nothing, and conclude the whole idea is nonsense. It isn't nonsense. It was just missing its foundation. Which brings us directly into the third principle, the one hill considered almost a technology in itself, autosuggestion. This is the deliberate, repeated communication with your own subconscious mind, and it matters because your subconscious does not evaluate whether a thought is true. It simply absorbs whatever gets repeated with enough emotional intensity, and then it goes to work making that thought a physical reality through your habits, your instincts, and the opportunities you suddenly start noticing that you swear weren't there before. Here's your callback for tonight, because I want this to stick with you long after this video ends. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it will find a way to achieve. Say that back to yourself right now, quietly, in your own head. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it will find a way to achieve. That sentence is not a decoration. It is the entire engine underneath everything we're talking about tonight. The inventor who gave the world usable electric light did not stumble onto it in a single flash of inspiration. He ran through roughly 10,000 failed attempts, and when a reporter asked how it felt to fail that many times, he refused the word failure entirely. He said he had simply found 10,000 ways that didn't work, which meant he was 10,000 steps closer to the one that would. That reframe wasn't a clever quote for the history books. It was auto-suggestion in action, a deliberate refusal to let his subconscious register those attempts as defeat. Because the moment your subconscious accepts the label failure, it starts producing the emotions and behaviors of someone who has already lost. He simply never allowed that download to complete. Think about the language you use with yourself after a bad day. Not the polished version you'd say out loud to someone else, the raw version, the one that runs on a loop at 11 at night. If that inner language is constantly narrating you as someone who's behind, someone who missed their window, someone who isn't built for this, your subconscious isn't going to argue with you. It's going to believe you, and then it's going to go to work proving you right. because that is its entire job. It doesn't distinguish between a story you're telling and a fact you're reporting. It just executes whatever gets repeated the loudest and the most often. This is precisely why willpower alone so rarely creates lasting change. Willpower is a conscious, exhausting, finite resource. You can only white knuckle a new habit for so long before you default back to whatever your subconscious has been trained to expect. Autosuggestion works differently. It doesn't fight your subconscious. It reprograms it quietly through repetition until the new belief stops requiring effort and simply becomes what feels true. That's the entire mechanism behind why successful people so often describe their achievements as inevitable in hindsight, even when the outside world saw nothing but risk. It stopped feeling like risk to them because the belief had already been installed long before the results caught up to it. Your action step: choose one sentence. It can be the same "whatever the mind can conceive" line, or your own one sentence goal from earlier, and write it somewhere you cannot avoid seeing it tomorrow. The lock screen of your phone, the mirror, the inside cover of a notebook you open every day. Repetition with emotion is the mechanism. Give it a place to repeat. Now let's talk about the principle most people quietly resent because it's the least glamorous and the most necessary: persistence. This is the one nobody puts on a vision board because it isn't inspiring in the moment. It's the boring, unphotographed middle of every success story that gets told after the fact as if it were inevitable. Before he became one of the wealthiest men in modern history, the man who would build a dominant force in the oil industry endured years of setbacks that would have ended most people's ambitions entirely: partnerships that collapsed, markets that crashed, competitors who tried to crush him outright. What separated him wasn't that he felt less fear or doubt than anyone else. Every account of his early years shows a man who absolutely felt the weight of it. What separated him was a simple, repeated refusal to treat a setback as a verdict. He treated every collapse as information, adjusted, and moved again. That is the entire difference between the people history remembers and the people history forgets. Not the absence of failure, but the refusal to let failure have the final word. Here's the myth worth busting directly. Most people believe successful people are simply more talented, or luckier, or started with more resources. Hill's research found something far less comfortable and far more useful: that persistence, not talent, was the single most common trait across every person he studied. Talent without persistence produces a long list of brilliant people who quit right before their breakthrough. Persistence without talent still produces results, because persistence is what buys you enough attempts for skill to eventually catch up. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you in a good way. Most people don't quit at the bottom, when things are obviously falling apart and quitting feels almost justified. They quit at the exact moment right before the turn, when the pressure is highest and the outcome is still invisible, because that is precisely when it is hardest to keep believing anything is about to change. Every single account of that oil empire's early years includes at least one point where nearly everyone around him assumed it was over. Investors pulled back, competitors circled, and the difference between him and the men who quietly disappeared from history in that exact same moment wasn't information they didn't have. It was one more day of continued motion, chosen deliberately, when quitting would have been not just understandable, but expected. Ask yourself honestly how many things in your own life you abandoned, not because they stopped working, but because you stopped believing they would right before they might have. There is no way to know, in hindsight, how many of your own quiet exits happened 1 week, one conversation, one attempt too early. That is not meant to shame you. It's meant to make the next decision easier, because now you know the pattern, and knowing the pattern means you get to interrupt it. Your action step: think of the one goal you are most tempted to quietly abandon right now, the one where the doubt has been loudest. Instead of deciding today whether you'll keep going forever, just decide you will take one more action on it tomorrow. Not forever, just tomorrow. Persistence is never one grand decision. It is 1,000 small ones made one day at a time by someone who has simply decided today is not the day they stop. There's a strange kind of relief in shrinking persistence down to that size. Forever is heavy enough to talk anyone out of anything. One more day is light enough that almost nobody can find a good enough excuse to refuse it. String enough of those single days together, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, and one day you'll look back and realize the thing that once felt impossible simply became your life. That's not a metaphor. That's the literal mechanism behind every one of the 500 stories this study was built on. The final piece of the puzzle is the one that explains why so many capable, hardworking people still stay stuck, no matter how strong their individual purpose, faith, and persistence become. It's called the mastermind principle, and it is deceptively simple. No person builds anything extraordinary entirely alone. Hill found that behind every major fortune he studied, there was a small, tightly aligned group of minds working in coordination toward a shared aim, and that the combined intelligence of that group produced results no individual member could have produced in isolation. One of the clearest illustrations of this comes from a friendship between the inventor we already mentioned, the automobile pioneer we already mentioned, and a tire manufacturing pioneer who joined their circle. These three men, along with a small handful of others, regularly spent time together, not merely socially, but as a working alliance, trading ideas, challenging each other's thinking, and creating an environment where each man's ambition sharpened the others. None of them achieved what they achieved purely alone in a workshop with the door closed. They achieved it inside a circle that refused to let any one of them shrink back down to average thinking. Here's the second callback worth holding on to. You become the average of the room you spend the most time thinking inside of. Say that one back too. You become the average of the room you spend the most time thinking inside of. If the people closest to you are comfortable with stagnation, some part of you will quietly learn to be comfortable with it too, no matter how loud your private ambition is. Notice something important about that circle, though. It wasn't a room full of cheerleaders telling each other everything would be fine. It was a room full of people willing to challenge each other's thinking, push back on lazy assumptions, and hold each other to a standard higher than any one of them would have held themselves to alone. That is the real definition of a mastermind alliance, and it's worth being honest about, because most people's social circles do the opposite. Most circles are optimized for comfort, not growth. They reward you for staying exactly where you are, because your staying the same keeps everyone else from having to examine why they haven't moved either. This is often the quietest, least discussed reason so many capable people stay stuck for years, despite genuinely wanting more. It isn't a lack of purpose or faith or persistence in isolation. It's that the room they spend the most time thinking inside of has never once asked them to expand. Nobody in that room is modeling the next version of them, so nothing in that room reflects it back as possible. Ambition, left completely alone, has an unfortunate tendency to quietly shrink to match its surroundings, not because the person is weak, but because human beings are wired to calibrate to their environment. It's not a character flaw, it's just how we're built, which means the fix isn't more willpower, the fix is a different room. Your action step is the most immediately actionable one tonight. Identify one person in your life right now who is already moving towards something ambitious, who would take your goals seriously instead of laughing it off, and reach out to them this week. You are not building an empire alone tonight. You are finding the first person to build it alongside. I want to step out of the teaching for a moment and talk to you a little differently because I think you've earned that by now. I've made scripts like this one before about ambition and mindset and the psychology of success, and there's a version of this genre that stays comfortable the whole way through. All momentum, no honesty. I don't want to do that to you tonight. The truth is, none of these 5 principles work as decoration. You can watch 100 videos like this one, feel something stir in your chest for 20 minutes, and go right back to the exact same numbed out autopilot tomorrow morning. I've done that. Probably you have too. It's not a character flaw. It's just what happens when information gets absorbed without ever being applied. The difference between the person who watches this and forgets it by Tuesday and the person who watches this and looks back on tonight as the actual turning point isn't intelligence, and it isn't luck. It's whether you do the small, almost embarrassingly simple things in the next 24 hours. Write the one sentence, say it out loud, reach out to the one person. That's it. That's the whole bridge between where you are and where those 500 people started. I think part of why this particular study still resonates generations later is that it never promised an easy path. It didn't say the number in your subconscious would flip overnight or that faith alone would pay your bills next month. What it actually found was quieter and I think more honest than that. It found that ordinary people with ordinary starting points kept making a small set of extraordinary internal decisions over and over in moments nobody else was watching. Nobody saw Carnegie define his purpose. Nobody saw Ford hold his certainty through another rejected loan application. Nobody saw Edison repeat his reframe after failure number 4,000. Those moments happened in private, which is exactly why they get left out of the highlight reel version of these stories that we tell each other afterward. We only see the mansion, the empire, the name on the building. We never see the specific Tuesday night where the decision actually got made. Your Tuesday night is tonight. Nobody else needs to witness it for it to count. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it will find a way to achieve. You become the average of the room you spend the most time thinking inside of. Those two lines are yours now. Carry them. So here's the one thing I want you to remember when everything else from tonight fades. The secret was never that those 500 people were fundamentally different from you. The secret is that at some specific, identifiable moment, each of them stopped waiting for permission to want more and simply decided. That decision is available to you tonight, in this exact room at this exact hour, with nothing else needing to change first. You don't need new circumstances to start. You don't need more money, more time, or a cleaner starting point than the one you've got right now. Every single person in that study started from wherever they happened to be standing, with whatever they happened to have, and the standing still is what changed first, long before the circumstances ever caught up. The number in your subconscious was written by someone else. Tonight, you get to pick up the pen. In the next 24 hours, write your one sentence, say it out loud twice, and send one message to the person who could stand beside you in this. Do not wait for Monday. Do not wait to feel ready. The 500 people this study was built on were never ready either. They just moved anyway. If you're taking this seriously, tell me in one word in the comments what you're committing to tonight. Purpose, faith, persistence, whatever word is burning in you right now, put it down where you can't take it back. I'll be watching for it.